At the will, reading, the sound that struck hardest wasn't the lawyer's voice. It was my parents laughing as they handed my sister a check worth more than most houses. Then a $1 slid toward me, crisp and mocking. My father didn't blink when he said, "Go earn your own." My mother smirked, almost pleased with herself. Some kids just don't measure up. No one disagreed, not even my sister. I stayed silent, my hands still on the table, while the lawyer hesitated over a sealed letter. My grandfather left only for me, pausing just long enough to make my mother's smile falter. I used to think silence was just something rooms had when people stepped out of them. Growing up, I learned it could sit beside you, even when the whole family was at the table, filling plates, pouring water, passing dishes over your hands as if you weren't there. At 8, I learned how invisibility worked. It wasn't that no one saw you, it was that they pretended not to. I remember one afternoon in late fall, the same kind of cold light that would later spill across that will reading table. Before I continue the story, tell me first, where did you hear this from? Write it in the comments, because what happens next, most people won't believe. Mother was arranging trophies on the living room shelf, polishing each brass plate with the sleeve of her sweater. All of them belonged to Lyanna. Debate medals, piano competition awards, a glass plaque with her name etched in sharp surf letters. My own project ribbon, a blue strip I earned at a county science fair, sat folded on the corner of a side table. No frame, no polish. By the end of the evening it wasn't there anymore. My father always said things like, "Focus on real achievements," while tapping Lyanna's shoulder, telling her which internships she'd get, which schools would take her. He spoke to me differently, less like a daughter, more like a placeholder, the one expected to manage the things no one else wanted. Walking the dog, cleaning the yard, returning forgotten items. "You're steady, Julia," he said once, as though steadiness was a consolation prize. But the only person who didn't talk to me that way was my grandfather, Walter. His voice was slow, patient, as if he were letting me decide whether his questions deserved answers. He'd take me to the lake house on weekends, the scent of old wood and the quiet thrum of water against the dock settling into my bones. He kept 2 fishing rods, one new, one carved with his initials, and always handed me the carved one. "People pay attention to the wrong things," he told me. "They look at the surface, not the pull underneath." Those afternoons were the only time I felt seen. We'd sit with our lines in the water, letting the wind shift the reflections. He never asked why I was so quiet, he already understood. Once he nudged his chin toward a bird perched on the railing, its feathers ruffled by the breeze. "Watch long enough," he said, "and you notice what others miss." I didn't realize it then, but he was giving me the very skill my family lacked, the ability to read between actions, to track truth in the smallest details. 1. Winter break, when Lyanna won another award, my parents threw a dinner. Friends filled the house with bright voices and heavy perfumes. I stood in the hallway carrying coats to the back room. As I passed the dining table, I heard my mother laugh softly, the same way she did at the will reading years later. "Julie is fine," she told a guest. "She doesn't need much." That sentence stayed with me longer than any argument could have. It was the moment I understood that in this family, needing nothing meant deserving nothing. It wasn't cruelty. They simply believed their own story about who deserved what. I went back to the lake house the next morning. My grandfather was already at the dock sorting through tackle boxes. When he saw me, he didn't ask why I'd come early. He just handed me the carved rod and waited until I sat beside him. The water was still, the air cold, the world honest in a way home never was. That was the day I learned my place in the Hartman family, and the day realized I would eventually have to choose whether to stay in it. The morning after the will reading, the house felt wrong. Too bright, too busy. My parents moving through the lake house like surveyors, opening drawers, lifting framed photos, talking numbers as if grief were an accounting category. I stood near the window, watching frost melt along the deck rail, trying to quiet the echo of their laughter from the day before. Lyanna drifted in with a mug she didn't drink from. She hovered beside me like she wanted to say something meaningful but couldn't risk choosing the wrong words. "It was a shock for all of us," she murmured, eyes fixed on her reflection in the glass. "Not me, us." Even in comfort, she centered herself. My father entered next, carrying a stack of folders from my grandfather's office. He set them on the table and thumbed through the pages with the casual ownership of someone convinced they deserved everything. "We'll sort this," he said, meaning they would. His gaze skimmed past me the way one glances past a coat rack. "Your sister will handle most of the responsibilities." My mother followed behind him, sorting envelopes, humming a tune I couldn't place. When she reached the small pile left for me, just the dollar, the sealed letter and a key, she paused long enough for the silence to thicken. Then, without looking up, she delivered the line that locked everything into place. "Go earn your own." No heat, no hesitation, just a verdict. Lyanna shifted her weight, uneasy. My Father pretended to reread a document. The only sound was the distant creak of the dock settling into the cold water outside. I didn't respond. My hand tightened around the sealed envelope, its weight suddenly heavier than everything they'd claimed for themselves. For the first time I realized they weren't overlooking me, they were erasing me, and they expected me to let them. I left the lake house before anyone noticed. No door slam, no goodbye, just the soft click of the latch behind me. The air outside carried a thin edge of winter, sharp enough to keep me steady as I walked to my car. I set the sealed envelope on the passenger seat and drove toward town, the trees blurring into one muted line. Every mile loosened the grip of their voices. At the small inn near the ridge, a place my grandfather and I once stopped for hot chocolate, I checked in without giving a reason. The owner, Rosa, recognized my name but didn't ask questions. She handed me a key and pointed to a quiet corner room. A gift really, 4 walls. That didn't demand anything from me. Inside, I set my notebook on the desk and finally opened the envelope. A key, a short letter in my grandfather's handwriting, a set of numbers and one line underneath. Start where the truth was first bent. No instructions beyond that, no explanation. Just enough to pull me into the dark corners he'd always hinted at, the places where appearances had replaced honesty in our family, long before I understood the cost. I read the letter 3 more times, tracing each loop of his pen. Then I opened my notebook and wrote the numbers down. I ran them through every pattern I could think of, dates, entries, valuations. Eventually the columns aligned in a way that made sense only if you knew why someone would hide certain payments and inflate others. And I did. I powered on my laptop and began the work I knew best, quiet, methodical, precise. I checked archived documents tied to my grandfather's old company. I compared notes with public filings. I mapped the flow of payments that matched the official timeline. When something didn't align, I color-coded it. When something repeated, I boxed it in red. Hours passed like minutes. No fury, no tears, just clarity. The truth wasn't hiding. It was sitting in plain view, waiting for someone who wasn't invested in the illusion to actually look. By late afternoon, the notebook was half filled. Patterns emerged. So did motives. A particular set of payments, rounded amounts, always just below thresholds that would trigger review, appeared again and again under a shell entity my father once advised. I leaned back in the chair, letting the weight of it settle. Not surprise, not even disappointment, just confirmation of what silence had been whispering through the years. I drew a line on a fresh page. Then I began assembling a timeline, dates, locations, signatures, inconsistencies, everything grounded in public record or the materials my grandfather had tucked away in his study. No accusations, no speculation, only facts arranged cleanly. Enough that they spoke without interpretation. I didn't need to fight them. The truth could do that on its own. When the sun dipped behind the hills, I took out the second item from the envelope, the key. I knew exactly which door it belonged to, the locked cabinet beneath his desk, the one he always touched before leaving the study, a habit I'd filed away years ago without understanding. I closed my notebook and slid it into my bag. Then I drove back to the lake house, arriving after twilight. Their cars were still there, positioned neatly like pieces on a board. I moved quietly, my steps absorbed by the damp wooden planks. Inside, the house was dim, a few lights glowed in the hallway. Laughter drifted from the living room, thin, uneasy forest. They were talking about investment projections, even now still hungry. I slipped into the study without being seen. The air inside was still holding the faint scent of old books and cedar. The desk lamp cast a soft circle of light around the locked cabinet. I knelt and fitted the key into the metal slot. It clicked open with a sound that felt final. Inside were binders, thin, labeled only by years, a stack of notes in my grandfather's handwriting, a small recording device, a few printed emails, and a single envelope addressed to me sealed with the same care as the first. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I sorted through the binders. Page after page confirmed what I had already traced: my parents' fingerprints on decisions that stripped him of control, in ways he never publicly admitted. Rounded payments. Notes written in my father's legal phrasing, a pattern of advice that didn't match the outcomes. I scanned what mattered and stored the digital copies in a cloud folder, then backed them up twice. Simple, professional, clean. In the corner of the study was a camera, so small it blended into the wood frame of the bookshelf. I hadn't noticed it before, but my grandfather's letter had said everything I needed to understand truth is only effective when the right people see it. The lake house recorded everything: their actions, their words, their intent. I stood slowly, letting the realization settle like dust in a quiet room. This wasn't revenge. This was administration carried out by a system he built, now placed in my hands. I closed the cabinet, locked it again, and slipped the key into my pocket. No need to announce anything, not yet. As I stepped back into the hallway, I heard my mother's voice rise crisp and certain. Julia will stay out of this. She never had the mind for complex matters. I paused unseen. Their voices filled the house, confident in their assumptions, unaware that the walls were finally listening. I turned away, steady and silent. This time I wasn't here to be included. I was here to finish what he started. Morning light slid across the lake house floor in a thin, cold line when I returned. My parents were already dressed too formal for the hour, too composed for what they believed was still under their control. Lyanna hovered nearby, twisting the edge of her sleeve. When the knock sounded, all three straightened as if bracing for applause. It was only Mr. Boone, my grandfather's longtime friend. He stepped inside quietly, carrying a folder and a small device. He nodded at me first, then at the others. No greeting. My mother's smile tightened. Is this necessary? He didn't answer. He simply placed the folder on the table and pressed a button on the device. The room filled with the soft click of an audio file starting. Then came my grandfather's voice, steady, unmistakable, recorded in the same study. Where my parents had spent yesterday tearing through his things. If this is being heard, it means the conditions have been met. My father shifted, caught off balance. My mother's expression stayed rigid. Grandpa continued. I trusted the people closest to me to handle my work with integrity. Some did not, so I left instructions to ensure the truth would be seen clearly without debate. A second click. Footage appeared on the small screen. My parents in the study, opening drawers, discarding photos, evaluating items like inventory. Their voices carried plainly talk of property value, leverage, entitlement. My mother stepped forward. This is taken out of context. We were. Mr. Boone raised a hand. Silence. Another clip followed. This time records projected onto the screen. Payments, notes, rounded numbers, the same anomalies I had circled in my notebook. My father's initials appeared more than once. My mother's signature on advisory memos she had always claimed were routine. My father exhaled sharply. Old paperwork misinterpreted. This doesn't prove any. The recording shifted again. My grandfather's voice returned softer, now edged with weariness. Julia, if you're hearing this, you have already seen what they hoped would never be found. The will reading was not the end. It was the beginning. Everything that comes next relies on what you choose to do with truth that was buried. My mother's composure cracked. A flash of panic cut through her eyes. Julia, stop this. You don't understand how these things work. But I didn't say a word. Mr. Boone opened the folder, sliding out a set of documents clean officials signed long before my grandfather died. These are the final directives, he said. Your father and mother retain the properties assigned to them. Your sister retains her trust, but the remainder of the estate, including the controlling interest in your grandfather's research foundation, transfers to Julia alone. My father stood. Absolutely not. This can be contested. It can, Boone said calmly. But if contested, every asset defaults to the foundation in full. That was Walter's stipulation. There is also a clause regarding possible legal review of past advisory work. You know which work he meant. The room quieted. My mother's breath hitched. Lyanna stared at the floor, cheeks pale. I stepped forward, not to speak but to place the key from the locked cabinet onto the table. A small sound, barely audible. My mother flinched as if it were a gavel. Boone met my eyes. All that's left is acknowledgement. I nodded once. No anger, no victory cry, just the clean click of something falling into place. My parents said nothing, not because they agreed but because they finally understood there was nothing left to argue. Behind them, the lake outside the window stayed still. The dock didn't creak. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. The reversal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I stayed behind after everyone left, letting the lake house settle back into its natural quiet. The air inside still carried the faint smell of cedar and old paper. My grandfather's trace untouched by the storm that had just passed through. I stood by his desk, fingertips resting on the worn edge, the same place he used to tap when he was thinking. Now it felt like a boundary line I'd finally stepped over. Outside, the water barely moved. A thin layer of mist hovered above it, rising and fading in slow breaths. I opened the door and walked to the dock, boards cool under my feet. The same boards I had sat on as a child with a simple need to understand the world. Back then, Grandpa would point at the quiet surface and say, "Still water tells the truth if you know how to listen." For the first time in months, I listened. No echoes of my mother's voice, no sharp corrections from my father, no strained smiles from my sister, just the soft lap of the lake and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I didn't replay what had happened inside. I didn't wonder whether they felt guilt or loss. Their reactions were no longer mine to carry. The documents, the recordings, the truth. They had done their work. What remained belonged to me alone. The sun pushed through a break in the clouds, laying a thin gold stripe across the water. I watched it stretch toward me, warm and patient like an invitation. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. I sat on the edge of the dock, letting my feet hover above the surface. The cold air touched my skin lightly, almost gently, as if the lake itself recognized the shift. For the first time, I felt the beginning not of justice, but of freedom. In the end, it wasn't the documents or the recordings that changed anything. It was the silence that followed, the kind that settles only when truth is no longer questioned. Some endings arrive quietly. Some freedoms too. I stepped back from the dock, knowing this time the quiet belonged to me. If this story stayed with you, linger a moment, breathe and stay close. If you enjoyed the story, hit like, drop a comment and subscribe for the next chapter.